How do you influence senior management at your company? By the end of this video or podcast, wherever you're watching or listening, you're going to have 3 tips to influence senior management in your organization. Hey, I'm Jonno, founder and principal consultant of Clarity and author of Step Up or Step Out, how to deal well with difficult people even if you hate conflict like me. And I just want to firstly say thank you for subscribing, following, liking, sharing. This is the Jonno Leadership Podcast, and I really appreciate you doing that. So if you haven't, please tick that box, subscribe, follow, like, share. It helps us to help more leaders like you to become the very best they can be. So today we're talking about this idea of how do you influence senior management at your company. And I'm going to give you 3 tips on that. I remember really hearing about this from an organization I worked with over in the US, and I was just working with someone who was in middle management, and I remember her just talking to me about how she was really struggling to work out how to lead up. And it's not something that's uncommon. She was a great leader. She was a very competent person. That's how she'd found herself rising through the ranks so fast. But the frustration she was having was a sense of really just hitting her head against a ceiling with the senior management. She had just hit this point where suddenly they were having a lot of say in her day-to-day world, and she was confused about how, Jonno, how do I lead up? How do I change? How do I make a difference without offending them? I want to do it appropriately. I don't want to be unreasonable, but at the same time, they need to know blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I know what that's like. It's really hard, isn't it? Because she was in that position where she was frustrated, she was confused. She's a very competent person, high achiever, and she's asking, how do I lead up well? And I remember for her, that was the biggest challenge, was how do I lead up to the people above me in a way that honors them, respects them, but also helps see change. And that was an ongoing challenge for her. So this is something I've worked with a lot of leaders on. I want to give you 3 tips. The first tip is I want you to imagine a scale, okay? So if you imagine what are they called? Well, a seesaw, okay? A seesaw where you've got down on one end, down on the other. Often what we do is we, there's 2 extremes to the seesaw, and we sort of feel like that we go big on one and boom, it puts it way out of balance. And so we try to bring everything back towards the middle. But as I so often say, I believe in this idea called extreme balance, which I first heard from a pastor called Steve Dixon at Hillsong Church, and just love this thought of extreme balance. He talks about this idea of extreme balance like, it's not about compromising towards the middle. It's about holding things in tension and going extreme at both ends. And I think there's such rich wisdom in that. And I certainly believe that for you when you're leading up. The first extreme over here, which is my first tip for you, is to have their back in public. Have their back in public. My encouragement to you when it comes to leading up is when you're not in the room with them, wherever possible, there's a couple of things I want you to think about. Firstly, I want you to think about how can you do your job in such a way that they never even have to think about it, particularly those of you who have senior management as your direct reports. What would it look like to do your job so they never even have to think about the area that you're leading, right? And the second thing, and so when you can do that, when you do your job so well, when you have their back in public spaces, that's the first extreme. But then there's this extreme over here, which is when you're in the room, I want you to be as vulnerable as possible. So you have their back. Whenever you're outside of the room, you have their back. That doesn't mean you never disagree with anything or you never have robust discussions with other people about things, but you just have their back. You're not undermining them, you're not white-anting, you have their back, and you're sorting out your area so well that you're thinking, I really, they should never even have to think about your area because you're doing it so well. At the other end of the other extreme, which is the second tip, I want you to be as vulnerable as possible when you get in the room with them. So when you get in the room with senior management, I've got their back over here, but when I'm face to face with them, I'm going to speak as vulnerably as possible. It doesn't mean you need to speak extremely emotionally, okay? The less emotional you can be, the better, where possible. I know it's hard sometimes, particularly when we're so passionate, but try to take as much emotion out of it as possible. But be as vulnerable as possible. Be as raw, if that makes sense. You want to keep your emotion, you want to make it as easy to communicate it as possible by keeping emotion in terms of, you can talk about the emotion, but try not to get hot in terms of the temperature of how you're speaking emotionally. But be as vulnerable to their face as possible. This is what I'm experiencing. This is what I'm seeing. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but when we made that decision, I know I've had your back and I've gone there 100%, but for me, I don't know, it's been a bit hard because of X, Y, or Z. This is the absolute extreme balance you want to achieve if you're leading up. I've got your back publicly. I'm going to smash my area so well that you never even have to think about it. But then when I'm in the room with you, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think, exactly how I feel. I'm going to be really vulnerable. What do? We often go the other way around when we're leading up. We tell them what they want to hear. We're not vulnerable in the room, and then we go and talk about them behind their back. And that's the recipe for disaster. That's the second tip. And the third tip, I've got some bad news. The leader of an organization is the ceiling of an organization. Not when it comes to their personal ability to achieve things. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously the teamwork makes the dream work. It's all about the team. But what I mean is the ceiling of the leader for vulnerability, the ceiling of the leader for culture, the ceiling of the leader for emotional intelligence and for investing in team, for investing in people, for a culture that raises up leaders. If your leader has a ceiling, your point leader, your senior leaders in a company have a ceiling here, then that will be the ceiling for the organization. Sometimes we feel really called and there's a sense that I need to stay here and keep going. Other times my encouragement would be, we need to be realistic. And if that's where your senior leaders are at, then realize, go to work knowing that's probably going to be the ceiling. Now, I know that's not the pep talk you needed to hear, but what it might be is sometimes people need a bit of an encouragement to go, well, maybe you need to find different leaders. Maybe you need to find an organization. If that for you, if you got a low ceiling that you're working in and you were really passionate about an amazing culture and being part of a place that just does incredible things and invests in people, then maybe you need to look at finding somewhere where the leaders have a higher ceiling. That's my third tip. And I know it's not the pep talk you might have wanted to hear, but in my opinion, sometimes we need to address, as Jim Collins talks about, the brutal facts of reality. And that's actually a really healthy thing to do. So there are 3 tips. If this has helped you to get clear on anything in your leadership, comment with the word clarity wherever you're watching or listening. And thank you again for subscribing, following, liking, sharing. If you haven't done that, please do that now. Click on it. It helps us to help more leaders to become the very best they can be. And it also means that you'll stay in the loop with all of our great content about leadership, which we're always producing here at Clarity. And thank you for spending time with me. I don't underestimate the time and the value of your time. So I don't take it lightly. I really appreciate that you are watching or listening to this. If you're hearing me say this, then you've stuck it through to the end, and I don't take that lightly. I believe in you. It's a privilege to get to speak into your life and your leadership, and I look forward to hanging out next time. Cheers.